Hello and welcome to our lecture today that I've entitled Narrative Journeys, Epics and the Ramayana. We're going to have an introduction to the Mahabharata, which we will be looking at extensively over the next couple of modules. And then I'm going to run you through the plot of the Ramayana. The Ramayana and the Mahabharata are the two great Hindu epics. So we've had a shift. So up to this point, we've been looking primarily at rituals in the Veda and Vedic ritual, but now we're going to turn to stories, the stories of the Hindu epics. And I want you to remember that we're still in kind of the world of the Vedas. We'll see that many of our characters who are kshatriyas, so the warriors or the baron class, there are many of our heroes, but there are some Brahmins involved, but they're continually doing Brahmin rituals. In particular, we see them doing the Rajasuya, which is a royal consecration. And we also see the Ashvamedha, so the horse sacrifice to consolidate rule. We'll see that many of our characters today will perform Ashvamedhas. So what is epic literature? From the Oxford English Dictionary, an epic is a poem typically derived from ancient oral tradition, which celebrates in the form of continuous narrative the achievements of one or more heroic characters of history or legend. Our great epics in the West are the Iliad, the story of the Great War between the Greeks and the Romans, and the Odyssey, which is the story of Odysseus, who after the Odyssey had to battle his way back home to Greece. It's also in Latin, this is the Aeneid. So other forms of epic literature in the West are often extended to Dante and his Divine Comedy, also poetry coming out of an oral tradition that's sort of codified and becomes a work of great poetry. The Book of Job is often included in comparative Western epics because of its convention of poetry and storytelling and the way the events work. In the East, you have the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. So all of these do come from an oral background. These would have been repeated and performed and memorized. Now, the Mahabharata and Ramayana were written down at a very early stage, but you still have people who do sort of folk performances of these genres and other folks who actually have the entire text memorized and will recite and repeat them. So how are these epics encountered? Well, you can read the Sanskrit text, but most people don't unless you're a scholar like me. So you have a Sanskrit version of the Ramayana written by Valmiki. The Mahabharata was written by Vyasa. There's a Hindi version of the Ramayana called the Ramcharitmanas, of which I'll say more later. This was written in the 1600s in sort of a proto-Hindi, in fact. Many people have encountered these epics through comic book form. In fact, there's a comic book company called Amar Chitta Katha, which has the whole of the epics and many other Hindu tales. And that is how a lot of children, especially in the West, would have encountered these stories. In fact, when I was first learning about Indian mythology, I read a lot of these comic books, and I found that a lot of my Indian friends had encountered these comic books first and foremost as their source for Hindu stories. Also in film and television, in the 1980s, they televised a version of the Ramayana. Now, there had been big screen adaptations of these epics before, but when they made this serial in the 1980s, which ran once a week for a year, I think a year and a half even, and went through the entirety of the Ramayana, everyone was glued to it. The whole country of India would just shut down and everybody would gather around TVs. There weren't a lot of TVs at the time. And the guess is that the average television was probably watched by about 15 people, and much larger, of course. You would have very large gatherings to watch this television show. And it's still shown on Indian television today. It's wonderful. The subtitles aren't great. The Hindi's actually pretty easy, at least for me. But there have been other adaptations of the Ramayana that have been on TV in English and in Hindi and in all the regional languages. And they're on, you have networks on Indian cable right now that just have tons of these sort of Hindu epic tales. But the majority of people throughout time would have really encountered these stories as stories, and that people would, your mother, your father, your uncle would use these stories. And the two ways that they would usually use these stories is to describe people. They would say, oh, that person's like a Rama and that he does this, or a Sita and that he does this, she does this. But when you get to the Mahabharata, which we're going to be looking at later in the class, that one is really where people will use these texts to describe not only personality types, but situations and trying to figure out the ethics of any situation. Like I said, this context is post-Vedic, it's sort of Upanishadic. At this time, there would have been lots of kingdoms that would have been in conflicts. There was no large empire. The empire of the Mauryas had, in fact, passed down. The Mauryas, as I talked about earlier, were the first great Indian empire, and they ruled most of North India for several generations, and they collapsed right about the time that these texts, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, began being written. So you can see this as being sort of a post-Mauryan time where you have lots of rival kingdoms. These are also considered smriti texts. Everything we've seen before were shruti, what is revealed, what is heard. Smriti means what is remembered or what is written down. The Mahabharata is incredibly long. It is the world's longest poem. It has 74,000 verses. And considering that usually if you would look at it, it would have a commentary written on it, so you'd have somebody explaining it as they go along. It's just a colossally long text. It's 15 times longer than the Bible. It is 8 times longer than the Iliad and the Odyssey combined. So we're talking about the Mahabharata here. I'll move to the Ramayana in just a second. It was composed and codified around 300 BCE to 300 CE, so it's about a 600-year frame for when it was being composed and when it was getting collected in the version that we have it now. It is the story of 2 families of cousins, the Pandavas, the sons of Pandu, and the Kauravas, all the cousins in the Kuru clan. So all of the people in the Pandavas and the Kauravas are good, but the Pandavas are the heroes and the Kauravas are the villains. They're the villains because while they're generally pretty good people, they have a certain cruelty in regard to their cousins, the brothers Pandava. Now, there are 5 Pandava brothers, and we're going to meet them all in coming months, or in coming weeks, and coming lessons. The 5 brothers are, in fact, sired by the gods, but they were born to human women. The 5 brothers actually marry a single woman by name of Draupadi, and we will talk about that and the implications of that. And Draupadi also is a partial goddess. So what happens is, through various twists and turns, these Pandavas and Kauravas come to a war. They have this great war, and it is a war when one side is right and one side is wrong. They battle, and the Pandavas, who are normally the most ethical, good people you could imagine, they have to cheat and they have to lie and they have to steal in order to win. And God is on their side, for in fact, the god Krishna is fighting in their army, and Krishna advises them. The god Krishna advises them to lie, cheat, and steal. At the end of the battle, all the Kshatriyas, all of the warriors have died except for one. And from that one surviving Kshatriya becomes the whole life of the Kshatriya clan afterward. Okay, so after the war, the 5 brothers have lived, and one of their children has lived, and they rule for the rest of their lives, performing many Ashvamedhas, in fact, until it is time for them to die. At the time for them to die, they all leave their home and they go on this great quest, and one by one, they all fall away and die. Only the eldest brother, Yudhishthira, lives. He climbs a great mountain and ascends to heaven alive, and while he's there, he sees that his brothers are missing, but all of the Kauravas, all of his enemies are there, and they are happy. He says he cannot bear to live without his brothers. So he descends into hell, where he's reunited with his brothers, and then poof, it's all an illusion, and they are all united for the rest of time as ancestors in the afterlife. Now, this set of events, this great war, is thought to signal the decline of humanity. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, in Hinduism, you have 4 yugas, or 4 stages or ages of time. The Satya is the longest, in which people live very long lives. It's very easy to do ritual. There's very little illness. There's very little, and people live like thousands and thousands of years. So you have the Satya, sort of the golden age, the truthful age. Then you have the Treta, which is the 3rd age, in which lives are shorter, rituals are harder, but still, life is still pretty good. Then in the Dwapara age, this is the age that the Ramayana is set in, people start to be unethical. People start to be wicked. Lives start to get shorter. And at the end of that age is the Mahabharata. And we have this great war in which you're beginning to see mankind is no longer good. And you enter the Kali age. Now, this isn't Kali as in the goddess Kali, the female goddess in Bengal, the terrifying goddess who sticks her tongue out and carries a meat cleaver and a garland of skulls. But this is Kali. Now, when you're playing dice in India, and we'll see some dice playing when we get to the Mahabharata, you have 4 values. You have the Satya, which is the top value, the most valuable, the Treta, the Dwapara, so the third and the second most, and the Kali, which is the worst. It's like the snake eyes. It's called the dog's dice. In fact, it's the dog's throw. So when you enter Kali, it's like entering the worst age of gambling. It's like you're rolling snake eyes every time in the game of craps. Your dice only come to 1. Okay, so the Satya Yuga was supposed to be, as you see down here, 4 periods of 432,000 years. So the years decrease. So in the Kali Yuga, you only have one. It's only 432,200 years, and you can do that math on your own. But it gets short time. The time periods are shorter and shorter. At the end of the Kali Yuga, Kalki will come, who is a final incarnation of Vishnu, and Shiva will arise, and he will dance his Tandava dance, and the world will end. And then it starts back over again with the Satya Yuga. You can never escape. It's all Satya, Treta, Dwapara, Kali. Then there's a period of rest, and then gods create the worlds again. Okay, there are a couple of different sort of smaller parts of the Mahabharata which you might encounter more as you're looking at the text. So the Mahabharata actually contains a smaller version of the Ramayana called the Ramapakyanam, the Little Ramayana. You also have the Bhagavad Gita, the Song of the Lord, which if you've ever read about Hinduism, they will always say that the Bhagavad Gita is the most important of the Hindu texts, while the Bhagavad Gita is only one small section of the Mahabharata. I purposely don't teach the Bhagavad Gita in the Hinduism class, whereas many professors spend several weeks on it, because I think it's overdetermined. I don't think the Bhagavad Gita is as big of a deal to Hinduism as it has been in the last 150 years, but that's another argument. You also have the Harivamsha. This is like the last book that was like tacked on, and it's the story of Krishna's youth and Krishna's life. And this becomes sort of like the bare bones of the mythology around Krishna that gets worked out a lot more later. So in these 3 ways, we can really see how the Mahabharata becomes very important, because it contains a smaller version of the Ramayana. It contains this text, that the Song of the Lord, which is considered to be the most important Hindu scripture by many contemporary Hindus, and you have the mythology of Krishna. But we're not going to be looking at that text in particular today. We're going to look at the Ramayana. So remember, we have 2 texts, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. The Mahabharata is the story of a great war. The Ramayana is the story of a great king who has to go into exile for various reasons that we're going to see. And he has to battle a wicked foe who's not actually all that wicked. And it's also a love story, because it's the story between God, who is Rama, and Sita, a goddess in her own right in many ways, even though she is in human form. And many people consider the great tale of the Ramayana to be about the love between Rama and Sita. It's also the war between Rama and Ravana. And it's also the story of Hanuman, the monkey god, and his great devotion to Rama and Sita. All right, so let's get started here. There are 2 versions of the Ramayana in many ways. You have one by Valmiki, which is in Sanskrit. Valmiki's name means something like he who lives in a termite mound. I was speaking today. The idea was he was meditating for so long that a termite mound grew over him. You'll see these termite mounds all over India, and they are considered to be sort of like gateways to the underworld, but it's often thought that yogis have sat meditating for so long that the termites build a termite mound around them. It's one of the wonderful, interesting little quirks about Hinduism is they revere termite mounds where also snakes live. Sorry. and they're gateways to the underworld. Okay. Sanskrit text by a guy named Valmiki, and that's the text we're going to be looking at today. Now, the other version of the Ramayana that people usually hear is this 15th century sort of proto-Hindi. It's written in a text in a language called Awadhi, and it's called the Ramcharitmanas. The Ramcharitmanas, sorry, I don't have it on a slide here. The Ramcharitmanas means sort of like the ocean of tales of Rama. It's a much shorter, much more condensed, and much more accessible version of the story. It also takes out some of the problematic parts of the tale, specifically the treatment of, specifically Rama's poor treatment of his wife, Sita. Okay, Rama is said to always do the right thing and to smile no matter what. He's an epic character. He's like the perfect man, the perfect Boy Scout of a man without moral ambiguity. But as we see, when we really dig into the text, there is some ambiguity to the god Rama. So the Ramayana in general is known to be a devotional text. It's thought to be the text that should inspire love and devotion to the god Ram, but it's also an imperial text. It's a text about a great Hindu king, and it's used by later Hindu rulers and contemporary Hindu fundamentalists to say that we should, that all kings and all governments should be Hindu and should be based on Ram's rule, the Rama Raj, the rule of Ram. Our main characters that we are going to see are Rama, who is an incarnation of the god Vishnu. He's a great warrior and king. Sita, his perfect wife, who's very much an incarnation of the earth, who is considered female, though not necessarily a goddess. I know, it's confusing. Anyway, and Hanuman, the monkey god, who is also the perfect devotee. All right, this is an enduring text. It's arguably the most popular of the epics in India. And it is, like I said, the 1980s, it was serialized, and then it became even more popular of a tale. There are versions of it throughout Southeast Asia. The story of the monkey that you find in Thailand, the story of the Monkey King in Thailand and Cambodia and Indonesia. You even have a stamp over here from Indonesia that has Hanuman on it. You see it in folk dance. You see it depicted in folk dance throughout Southeast Asia, even more so than in South Asia. In India, most of the epic dance performances are of the Mahabharata. Yes, there are also alternate versions in Buddhism, Sikhism, and Jainism. And in most of these, the main characters are bad guys because the Buddhist and Jain perspective is very different from the Hindu perspective. There are versions of the Ramayana that have been written from Sita's perspective, from Rama's wife perspective. Now, like I'd said before, the rule of Ram, or the Ram Raj, is used by contemporary Hindu fundamentalists as a justification for Hindu rule. Hindu nationalists will argue that when they commit violence in the name of Hinduism, that they are effectively like Hanuman's monkey army, the monkey army that supports Rama in his tasks. One of the most bitter conflicts in contemporary India is about a town that is thought to be, that is in the, it's one of the most enduring conflicts in contemporary India is over a temple in the town of Ayodhya in the north of India, where supposedly Rama was born. The temple dates to about the 1500s. It's not, well, it's now a temple, but it was actually a mosque. Let me say this one more time. We're going to do a whole day on this. In contemporary India, in the 1500s, there was built a mosque. The mosque, supposedly, though there's no archaeological evidence of this, was born on the place where Rama was born. This argues that Rama was a historical figure. In fact, he is an epic figure. He is a narrative figure. He's not a historical figure, but some people want to argue he was a historical figure and that he was born in a specific place where eventually a mosque was built. That mosque in the 1990s was torn down, and there was a whole bunch of violence, and a lot of Muslims were killed during that violence. The mosque was torn down, and then 20 years later, in fact, relatively recently, in 2020, they began to actually build a temple to Rama. It's called the Ram Janma Bhoomi, the land or the place where Rama was born. Okay. What about the plot? What is this story? Now, I've talked around this story quite a bit, and you've read about the story, and you've had, you've encountered the story in your reading, you've encountered a short YouTube video, and after you watch this lecture, I would like you to watch Sita Sings the Blues by Nina Paley, which is a contemporary interpretation of the Ramayana from Sita's perspective. Now, you might wonder to yourself why I'm having you watch a video by a white woman who's a cartoonist, but once you see the video, I think you'll get it. And it's had wide acclaim throughout the Hindu world. Hindu fundamentalists don't like it very much, but the majority of Hindus watch it and they recognize this story and they see some nuance to it, and it's a delightful tale and a really good representation of the story of the Ramayana. Oh, what does Ramayana mean? You may have heard of, in Buddhism, you have the Mahayana and the Hinayana. The Mahayana means the great vehicle. The Hinayana means the lesser vehicle. So what is the Ramayana? It's the vehicle for Rama. It's the tail, or it's the tail of Rama, but it's also the chariot of Rama. Yeah, so it's the Rama vehicle. Anyway, so let's get to the story. We're going to start here with the story of Rama's father. Dasharatra is Rama's father. Now, Dasharatra at an earlier time had engaged in a great battle with the demons, with the anti-gods, with the asuras, and his wife was serving as his charioteer at the time. His chariot broke an axle, and his wife, Kaikeyi, stuffed her arm into the axle, so her arm functioned as the axle and he could continue to battle, and she saved his life. Due to this action, he grants her 2 wishes, and she says, I'll take those wishes later. Well, later, Dasharatra desires a son. He has, in fact, 3 wives, and he decides to perform a horse sacrifice, once again, an Ashvamedha, in order to get a son. So as part of this sacrifice, he has a pot of sweet rice porridge, which is known as kheer. It's a delicious dish. I recommend you eat it any chance you can. It's a sweet rice dish that's flavored with like cardamom and whatnot. It's lovely. I should put up a recipe for it. Anyway, so Dasharatra is going to perform this horse sacrifice for the purpose of gaining a son. Once again, remember, we saw that the horse sacrifice has all these elements of fertility within it. So the king that performs a horse sacrifice well will ensure his family, the crops of the kingdom, and the women in the kingdom will be very fertile. He performs this horse sacrifice, and as part of it, he takes this pot of kheer, of rice porridge, and he infuses it somehow, I've never been clear on this, with Vishnu. The god Vishnu is in the pot. He doles out half of the pot to one of his wives who bears the child Rama. But there are 3 other children that are born, and they have smaller parts of Vishnu. And this is how the 3 wives have 4 children, where Rama, who is the main incarnation of God. Then you have Lakshmana and Shatrughna, who are partial incarnations of Vishnu. Lakshmana in particular is an incarnation of the snake Shesha, or Ananta, the cosmic snake, that you can see always when you see Vishnu like reclining. You'll always see he has a huge snake over his head, and that is the cosmic snake that incarnates as Rama's brother Lakshmana. And then Shatrughna, he who kills his enemies, he's around. And then Bharata, in fact, is the son of Kaikeyi. Now, Kaikeyi was his wife, one of his 3 wives. Kaikeyi was the wife that he granted the gift to because she saved his life. Kaikeyi bears a son, Bharata. All of these 4 brothers, Rama, Lakshmana, Shatrughna, and Bharata, are infused with Vishnu. Now, Rama is a god. He has this huge amount of Vishnu in him. The tricky thing is that he doesn't realize he is a god. Now, in these epic stories, we have an idea that's starting to develop. It gets developed later, of an avatar. I don't know if you've heard the word avatar before. Avatar means one who has crossed over or crossed downward. So in this sense, 2 of our main characters in the Mahabharata and the Ramayana are incarnations of the god Vishnu. Rama is an incarnation of Vishnu. In fact, amongst the 10 incarnations of Vishnu, he's known as Rama with the bow. Krishna is known to be Rama, or is known to be Vishnu with the flute, to show who these different ones are. Rama, great warrior. Krishna, also a great warrior, but also known for his artistry and playfulness. So anyway, Dasharatra at some point grows old. And he is desiring to make his favorite son, Rama, who's been married for about 12 years to this great gal, Sita. So Rama is supposed to become the prince. Now, Dasharatra says, all right, let's do this thing. Unfortunately, Kaikeyi, one of his wives, comes forward and says, nope, I want my son, Bharata, to be the king. Dasharatra says, no, Rama should be the king. Bharata says, no, Rama should be the king. And Kaikeyi insists. She's got that wish. Dasharatra has to honor his word here. Now, in other versions of the story, and as you dig into the layers of it, you find that Kaikeyi might not be as bad as you think. In some stories, she's possessed by a demoness. In this story, she has a hunchback woman who is her maid, who's always talking into her ear and convinces her that Bharata, not Rama, should be the king. Either way, Dasharatra has to banish Rama for 14 years into exile into the forest to be a vanaprashta, a forest dweller. So Rama goes off and goes away, and he dresses up kind of like an ascetic, but he still takes his wife, who he does not renounce his life completely. He just leaves for the forest. He's a vanaprastha. He's like the third stage, the third ashrama or stage of life. But he takes his weaponry, and Sita even says to him, if you are going to go and pretend to be an ascetic in the woods for the next 14 years, don't take your weaponry with you because you're going to end up getting into trouble. And guess what? He gets into trouble. So Rama goes off into exile with his brother Lakshmana and with his wife Sita. Now, Bharata is the other brother, and Bharata chases after him and says, you cannot leave. We love you. We want you here. You are the righteous king. And Rama is always known to smile no matter what happens. This is sort of a folk tale about Rama, because when you actually look, he gets upset all the time in the actual text. But there's always this story that, Rama is told, you're going to be the king. He says, okay, that's great. And he smiles. And it says, Rama, okay, you got to go off into exile. Okay, that's great. And he smiles. He is always the best version, is sort of one of the ideas about Rama, is he always does the right thing, and he always does it joyfully. As we're going to see, he doesn't always do the right thing, and he doesn't always act joyfully. But when I was first told this tale, it was that Rama always acted with everyone's best interest in mind. He had to honor his father, he had to honor his family, he had to do everything right, and he always did it with a smile. So Bharata takes Rama's shoes, and he says, I will put these shoes on the throne. I am only going to be the acting king. Your shoes will always be on the throne because you are the real king. And Rama turns to Bharata and he says, that's right. All right, smile. Do your thing. Go be the best king you can be. I will go to the woods for 14 years because of this request. However, within the text, there is a thing where Rama says that, in fact, the reason his father has to do this isn't just to honor his word and that he granted his wife a wish, but because he is obsessed with sex. And in fact, that he is too obsessed with making love to his wife Kaikeyi. And then, in fact, we also read that Kaikeyi had been withholding sex from him during this period. So she's sexually blackmailing him. It's a difficult tale. So the forest is not empty. In fact, it is filled with animals, some talking, some not talking. It's filled with ascetics. So you have other forest dwelling, like yogi types, that are out there in the forest doing rituals and having, doing rituals and whatnot. There are all sorts of, like I said, demons and demonesses and wild animals and whatnot. And he encounters a lot of them. But he doesn't go with him by himself. And in fact, in many ways, this world is very much the world of the Upanishads, of the Aranyakas, even those forest texts. So he goes to the forest with his devoted brother Lakshmana, who's a little bit of a hothead, and he also goes with his wife Sita. Now, I haven't really described Sita yet. Sita, her name actually means furrow, or like a crack in the earth even. It's said that Sita's father, Janaka, was plowing, in fact. Now, he wasn't plowing because he was a farmer. He was plowing because he was setting out like an Agni Chayana ritual or an Agni Stoma, where you have to set out and plow to create the grooves that mark out the ritual territory. So he's performing this ritual plowing, and he sees a beautiful celestial nymph, or an apsara. So a beautiful supernatural female creature flying by, and he becomes so excited at her beauty that he drops his seed, which is to say he ejaculates. And you see throughout Hindu literature and Hindu stories that often when someone will ejaculate, they'll lose all of their power. They'll lose all of what they call their tapas, their interior heat that they've built up by doing ritual and meditation. And when they become sexually excited and ejaculate, they lose all of that power. So he loses his power by ejaculating onto the soil. Later, as he's plowing, a little girl pops up who was thought to be the product of his seed that had fell into the ground, and Prithvi, the earth goddess, the earth that is a goddess. Not a specific goddess. She's very kind of vague, but we saw her mentioned in the Vedic rituals before. So Sita arises from the soil. In this sense, she is what's called ayonija. I don't have that on the slide. Sorry, ayonija, and I'll say this again. So yoni means vagina or vulva. Ja means born from a vulva. And then on the front means not, one who is not born from a vulva. And we will see that all these gods have some sort of odd thing in which they arise as having partial parents that are deities, and that they don't arise in the usual way. They're not born in the normal manner. We'll see that the various heroes of the Mahabharata were sired by a woman and a god, but that they just sort of arose. They weren't born in the normal biological manner, to say the least. So Sita is very much the earth. She is the child of the earth. She is the earth. She is the divine feminine. And we see that the more Rama realizes or is depicted as a god, we'll see that the more poorly Sita is treated. In this, we can see a paradigm shift away from a divine feminine and toward a more powerful divine masculine that dominates the divine feminine. There's a lot going on in that argument. Okay, so they're in the forest. Rama and Lakshmana are out hanging around, doing their thing, and they meet this beautiful demoness by name of Surpanaka. Now, she tries to put the moves on Rama, and Rama's like, nah, I'm married, baby. You don't mess with me. Lakshmana might be into it. So she goes and tries to seduce Lakshmana, and he cuts off her nose and rips open her face. Now, this mutilation of someone's face, usually, and when done to a woman, is a punishment for a woman who has had adultery. We see in this the sins of Rama and Lakshmana. They did not have sex with Surpanaka, but the fact that they punished her as an adulteress shows that there is some sexual discomfort here. And in many tellings of this, a lot of folks talk about how wrong it was that Rama had Rama had basically tricked his brother into disfiguring this woman. And a lot of folks suggest that there's something underneath that maybe he had some ill towards thoughts, that there is an element of sexual impropriety, but there's definitely an element of sexual violence in the fact that Lakshmana disfigures her face. So Surpanaka goes to her brother. Who's her brother? The bad guy. Her brother is Ravana. Who is Ravana? Well, let me tell you what she does. She goes and shows her mutilated face to Ravana, and he's to her brother. He's like, "Oh, this is no good." But along the way, she also tells Ravana all about Sita. Now, Sita is supposed to be the most scrumptious female human being who has ever existed. She is the perfect woman. She is the most beautiful of the beautiful. She is the most beautiful thing who has ever existed until you get to Draupadi in the Mahabharata. But remember, Sita is one hot number. She is the most glorious female to ever walk the earth. She's, some women are described as being 9s and 10s. She's like a 100,000. So who is Ravana? Ravana is a demon. He is the demon king of Lanka, Sri Lanka, the island off the coast of southeastern India. Ravana, though, he's tricky. I mean, he's the king of an island full of demons. He has 10 heads, but he's a special kind of monster. Of those 10 heads, 4 of them just constantly chant the Vedas. One of them is constantly chanting medical texts. Ravana is considered to be not just the king of Lanka, but to be a very good and fair king, to really take good care of his disciples, who are demons. So they get up to no good every now and then, but they're not really malicious. So don't think of him as like a devil. Ravana is not a devil. He is not out to destroy people's souls. He's just a demon, which means he's going to do things like drink booze, and he is going to have trouble keeping his hands off the ladies. He's got a strong sort of demonic id, but he's not inherently evil. In fact, one of the texts that I've translated is called the Udisha Tantra, and it's a tantra that's about magic, mostly black magic, and it's said to be written by Ravana. And that text is considered to be one of the primary texts of in like sort of his royal library in Sri Lanka. So he is a master of medicine. He's a master of philosophy. He plays the veena beautifully. He is a devotee of the god Shiva. Now remember that Rama is an incarnation of Vishnu. Now Shiva and Vishnu aren't enemies per se. But generally with Hindus, you can split people as to whether they're into Shiva or they're into Vishnu. They're sort of rival gods, but they're different polarities. They're different types of deities completely. Some would say that there are two sides of the same coin that is God, but those two sides could not be more different. So Ravana can't keep his hands off the ladies. And when he hears about a lady, he's going to go for it. So he becomes obsessed with Sita. In fact, these days, people will invoke Ravana to describe a person. Now, Rama is the Boy Scout. Sita is the ideal woman and mother. Ravana is like someone who is the best at something, like so good, but the rest of his personality stinks. So if you meet a really, really good doctor who's kind of a jerk, they'll be, look at that Ravana over there. I've heard that said about several doctors I've known. My first teacher of Hinduism used to say that Ravana is like Bill Clinton. He's a really, really great leader, but he can't keep his hands off the ladies. And then my teacher would always say, but what are you going to do? He's a demon. You got to remember throughout India and throughout Hindu culture, you'll see people have to do their own dharma, what's called their swadharma, your own dharma that's unique to you. So Ravana's a demon. He's going to do demon dharma. Okay, so Ravana sends a bejeweled deer, a beautiful little deer that is actually a demon named Marichi, to distract Sita. He goes in, this deer who's just exceptionally beautiful and covered in jewels, sees Sita, and Sita sees them, and Rama and Lakshmana are all hanging out like in the forest, and Sita sees this deer and she's like, oh Rama, you gotta go get that deer. I need that deer. It's unclear whether he's gonna kill the deer or bring it back for her to be a pet or whatever, but she has to have it. Now Rama's a little resistant, but on the other hand, he really likes to hunt. And generally when people go hunting in these texts, bad things tend to happen. So he chases after the deer, leaving Lakshmana alone to guard Sita. And he says, whatever happens, you got to take care of Sita. Unfortunately, Sita decides that she hears Rama in danger. It's Ravana tricking her. And Lakshmana's like, I don't hear anything. And she says, Lakshmana, 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 you are my dearest, brother, my husband's brother. You must go save Rama. And Lakshmana's like, Rama's probably fine. He's kind of a bad hombre. And eventually Lakshmana deserts Sita and goes off. Ravana shows up dressed as a great ascetic, dressed as like a monk and a renouncer. And he tricks Sita into letting her into the house. And at that point, he kidnaps her. And he flies her off to Sita. She grabs him, he grabs her and flies off to Lanka. And she drops whatever jewelry she has as like little breadcrumbs for Rama to follow. Now, I need to take a little backstory here. There is a side story that is one of my favorite stories in the Ramayana, so I'm going to take a second and tell it to you. There are two brothers. They are both monkeys. They are talking monkeys. They are divine monkeys. They are very powerful spiritual entities and great kings. They are brothers. Vali and Sugriva are brothers, and Vali rules the monkey kingdom. Now, in fact, you have two brothers here again, like Rama and Lakshmana, and conflicts. And Doniger rightly argues that they're analogs. These monkeys, Vali and Sugriva, are analogs to what's going on with Lakshmana and Rama. So what happens is Vali is basically the toughest guy on the planet. He is the baddest dude on Earth. Now, we have a problem. Vali is so tough. Vali, in fact, at one point had Ravana kind of try to sneak up on him, and they did battle, and he beat down Ravana. He beat down Ravana so bad, and then tied him up and made him a play toy to hang as like a Playmobil over his child's cradle. He at one point just walked around with Ravana in a headlock for a year, just ruling and like taunting Ravana. Eventually, though, Ravana kind of like gives up, says, let's be friends. And he admits that Vali is way more powerful than Ravana is. In fact, it's said that Vali has this special power, and that anytime he fights someone, half of their power gets pulled out and put into him. So he always has, if you're going to fight him, he takes half your power from you and adds it to what power he already has. So he is effectively always evenly matched from the start with someone, and then he has all his own power on top of that. So he's always as good as you and as better than you as he inherently is. It's tricky stuff. It's a good power to have. So the thing is, we're going to see that Rama's going to kill Vali. But when Rama fights Ravana, they have to fight. They fight for days and days. It's a tough battle that Rama isn't sure to win by any means. He ends up winning because this is a good story. But this guy was able to just beat down Ravana with not too much struggle in some variants. In some stories, they have to fight an awful lot. In some stories, he just takes them down with ease. I like to think that Vali takes down Ravana with ease. So how does this factor in? Well, like I said, you have Vali and Sugriva. They're two brothers. So they came into battle together, Vali and Sugriva did, with a very dangerous demon. And Vali's fighting him pretty good. Sugriva, a little bit more of a wuss, not doing too hot. Vali eventually chases this demon into a cave, and he's just down in that cave in the darkness, just fighting. And Sugriva hears all this, and he sees blood coming out of the cage, and he hears this ferocious battle, and he goes, "Whoop, Vali's not going to make it." And he throws he takes a big rock, and he walls Vali and the demon in. Now, people are of two thoughts. I believe that he saw this as an opportunity to get rid of his brother. Other people say he really was afraid for his life and thought the best thing to do was the demon was going to kill Vali, so trap them both down there. They'll kill each other, and the demon's going to kill Vali, and then the demon will be trapped. Anyway, Vali gets out. In the meanwhile, Sugriva has taken over the Monkey Kingdom and taken up with Vali's wife. So Vali shows up, beaten up pretty good, but victorious from battle, finds his brother on the throne and taken up and making the hanky-panky with his wife. So Vali is rightly pissed off, and he beats Sugriva to just an inch of his life, and Sugriva has to run off to a place where, oddly, it's a mountaintop, in which if Vali goes there, he's been cursed to. If he goes there, he'll automatically die. It's complicated. Anyway, Sugriva's hanging out with all these other monkeys, and eventually on this forest top, and he meets Hanuman, who we'll hear about in a second, but he also meets Rama, and he's instantly devoted to Rama. And Rama says, if you're devoted to me and you swear allegiance to me, then I swear allegiance to you. So I'm going to go kill your brother. I couldn't find a good picture, but this is somewhat close. What happens is Sugriva calls Vali into combat. Vali's like, all right, you want some more of this? I'm going to kill you this time. As Vali gets his weapons together and he comes forward to fight Sugriva once again, Rama sneaks up behind him and shoots him with an arrow and kills him. He shoots him from behind and kills him. How is this justified? How is it justifiable? It's wrong. And for me, this is like one of the great like sins in Hinduism. One of the greatest tragedies is this great awesome monkey king gets killed by God, who doesn't think he can do it with straight on combat to defend his Weasley brother that took his throne and his wife. There's moral ambiguity. Rama hides behind a tree, shoots Vali and kills him. There's some moral ambiguity here. Now, there is an intriguing tale that I quite like. At the end of the Mahabharata, which has God incarnating again as Krishna, Krishna is in the woods and a hunter shoots him thinking he's a deer, shoots him in the heel and it kills him. This isn't a connection to Achilles, but there's an analog there. So as Krishna is dying, this guy Jara, whose name also means old age, in fact, in Sanskrit, Jara comes up and says, "Oh my goodness, Krishna, I love you. How could I have killed you? I didn't know. And with like his last words, Krishna sort of smiles and says, "It's all right, man. You were Vali in the last life. This is fair. I did this to you. You did this to me. You just don't know that you were Vali." Anyway, Vali is killed. It's freaking horrible. It makes me really angry. Vali is killed, and Sugriva says, "All right, man, I'm the king again." So Vali's wife, Tara, who had taken up with him in the past, had taken up with Sugriva in the past, mourns Vali terribly, but she's gotta marry the wife. She's gotta marry Sugriva because he's now the king. So there's some complications there. Now, Sugriva kind of sucks. So Rama goes off to continue his battling fights to kind of find Sita again. And Sugriva kind of stinks. He just like hangs around, enjoys ruling, enjoys kind of getting with Vali's wife. And eventually it is Tara, Vali's old wife, that says, "You got to honor your vows and go help Rama out because, he killed my husband for you." This is a complicated story, and it's one I think about a lot. I've read it in Sanskrit several times. I just always get uncomfortable with the whole tale. Anyway, moving right along, I'm left saying, Sugriva's a bad dude. Why does God help him out so much? Anyway, let's continue. Hanuman hears that Sita is in Lanka. Now, we read about this today in the so-called Sundarkanda, which is the Tulsidas, the Hindi version of this text. I will be kind of talking to you through the Sanskrit version of it, but I wanted you to read this text. So this chunk of the Ramayana called the Sundarakanda, the very beautiful section, is one of the most popular versions of it. Is one of the most popular texts about the Ramayana that circulates in India today. Anyway, so Ravana has set up Sita with a bunch of demon attendants, but he shows up pretty regularly in his little harem and says, "You know what? You're going to end up sleeping with me. I'm not going to force you, but I might kill you if you don't do this." And she always says, "Nope, I'm not going to do it. I am pure. I love Rama and only Rama." Remember, Ravana's, he's a demon, but he's like the second coolest guy on the planet, maybe the third. I don't know. I think Vali's the coolest, then Ravana, then Rama. I don't like Rama very much. And you'll see why in a minute. So what happens is Hanuman takes off and flies over to the island of Lanka. While he's there, he wanders around. And the story in the Sanskrit of this is just beautiful because he talks about wandering through the demon city and seeing what all the demons are doing. And they're making cool art and also getting drunk and having parties. And he actually observes, and this is intriguing because Hanuman is considered to be celibate and to be like powerfully not, like he doesn't have sexual desires. But we see in the story, he's seeing all of these demons having like crazy drunken orgies. And he manages to avoid getting involved. I think, the character doth protest a bit too much. He eventually finds Sita. He sneaks around and he sees this beautiful city with all these demons doing crazy, cool, sexy stuff. And he eventually finds Sita. Now, he has to gain her trust. So what he does is he reveals himself and he gives her Rama's ring. And the ring rings true, as Wendy Doniger says in another book. She wrote a book about rings in literature. The ring proves that he is truly from Rama. So Sita says, all right, Rama's coming. And he's like, Hanuman's like, hey, you can just climb on my back and I'll take you to Rama right now. This can all be done. We don't have to have a big war. Ravana doesn't have to get killed. This whole beautiful town filled with people who happen to be demons, but they're nice demons, don't need to all be murdered. We can just do this. We can be done. And she says, nope. And the question there remains. Is it because she won't touch a man's body, even a monkey man? Is it because she's upset that he is a monkey, even though he's a divine monkey? Or is it that she just wants her boyfriend to come and kick this dude's butt because he was not good to her? It's hard to say. There is some ambiguity here. Anyway, Hanuman lets him sort of sneaks his way out, and he lets himself get captured so he can see who these demons are and meet this Ravana guy. Ravana's like, this monkey, I should kill you. And then somebody says, he is associated with Rama. He's effectively an emissary. Like he's effectively like a spy, or he's effectively like one of Rama's ministers. So we can't really kill him. He says, well, all right, he's a monkey. Monkeys like tails. So you know what? Set his tail on fire. I want that tail burnt. Well, here was me talking about Hanuman. Sorry, I got behind on my slides. Hanuman is considered sort of the greatest devotee. In his heart is thought to be only Rama and Sita. He has complete love for them in every way. Though as you look at this text really carefully, it seems that he's really, really devoted to Sita. That's another story. So he meets Sita, gives her the ring, and she says, no, I won't fly back on your back. And so he torches Lanka on fire. What happens is the demons set his tail on fire, right? And then he like shrinks down and sneaks out of his bindings. And then he gets huge and he's got, his fiery tail, and he just jumps all over the city. This is actually one of the parts that people really, really like of this story. And it's delightful to read about him just like scampering around like a monkey does, just jumping from tree to tree, lighting everything on fire. And there's a joy to it because it's like, demons, if you just let him go and hadn't lit his tail on fire like a bunch of big jerks, he wouldn't have set your whole place on fire. So Hanuman escapes and burns the whole place to heck. And then he flies back over to India and meets with Rama. Well, Rama gets his monkey army together with, so he has Sugriva to some degree, whatever. But he has Hanuman and all the other monkeys that are called Vanaras or Bandars. And they build a bridge to get over to Lanka because they all can't fly. Now, the cool thing about this is they take rocks and they write the name Rama on all the rocks. And when they set them on the water, they just float there by the power of even the ocean's love for Rama. They cross over from India on this stone bridge, this bridge of floating rocks. And in fact, people are always kind of like trying to find these rocks. And I think it was a hoax. Obviously it was a hoax, that they have found a whole bunch of stones that could have been a land bridge at one point that are underwater. And people say that's evidence of the monkey bridge. I'm not so sure. Anyway, there are days and days and days of battling. All of Ravana's brothers are killed. Everybody fights. At one point, Lakshmana is really badly wounded. So Hanuman flies off to the Himalayas to get sacred herbs that will sort of save him. And he can't figure out what herb to get. So he actually just lifts an entire mountain and carries it to Lanka to get the herbs that will heal Lakshmana, who is badly harmed in battle. Eventually, after a lot of fighting, Rama slays Ravana, and Rama prevails. He takes Ravana's brother, Vibhishana, who had already defected from the demons and was helping Rama out, and he sets him up as the new demon king of Lanka, and things go well. Life is good after Ravana dies. It's unfortunate that Ravana dies, though. And it's also unfortunate that Sita didn't just jump on Hanuman's back and then everybody wouldn't have had to die. But yeah, so anyway. So now we are moving to the era of the epic. That's the last part I'm going to tell you about, that I just kind of like to call the Rama is a jerk section. We're about to watch Rama be an absolute dick. Now, remember, when people talk about the Ramayana, they say that Rama is the perfect man. They say that he's doing everything right. and he's doing everything righteously. And then he is in perfect equipoise. He is always smiling. He's always happy and doing his duty. In fact, he is not. He has a lot of problems. You see, he kills Vali. He gets all mad and crazy when he talks about his wife being kidnapped. Like, he's so distraught while Sita is gone. He's just pining over and in like this mad rage over his separation from her. But once he gets her back, they're reunited, and they still have to live out to the very end of their exile, to the 14th year. We were in year 13 for a lot of these great battles. And during this time, Rama starts to get really unnerved. He starts to become unnerved about her faithfulness while she was with Ravana. He starts thinking things like, how could you have been all that time in another man's bedroom effectively and not slept with him? How could you have held your chastity strong when women are universally so bad? To which she says stuff like, you can't judge me based on all women. I'm Sita, for darnest sakes. And she was clear. She was good. She did not sleep with Ravana. She did not let him touch her other than when he grabbed her. She was righteous. She was chaste. So Rama has, a couple of arguments. One are all women are corrupt and you're a woman. Two, any woman who's that long in proximity to a man is corrupt. Three, he probably raped you and thereby you're defiled even if you didn't want it. And four, even if all of this is true, and this is really the troubling thing that you're going to see, and this will come up a couple of times, even if you were chaste that whole time and didn't sleep with Ravana, people are going to think you did. And I'm the king. And people can't be thinking that the king's wife gets around or got around. So he proposes the Agni Pariksha. Pariksha is an interesting word. It means examination or investigation. In metallurgy, the pariksha is when you set metal on fire to see how pure it is. Like, you can see how pure gold is by heating it. So the Agni Pariksha is the examination by fire. Rama sets up a large flame. Agni, remember, a god. And Sita argues that if she passes through the flame unharmed, then she is true. Then she has been chaste the whole time, that she has never doubted him, even that she has never cheated on him in mind or in body. And she walks right through that fire. It is no problem. She is not burnt at all. Some versions of the text say that she was guarded by the fire, that Agni guarded her. Others say that it was just purely mechanical. She was pure, so she did not get burnt. That's just the way it works. So, unfortunately, over time, there continues to be rumors. In fact, there's a famous story in which a dhobi or a washerman is overheard saying to his possibly unfaithful, likely unfaithful wife, after she returns to him, "Who do you think I am, Rama?" And at that point, Rama hears about it. And he's like, "The washermen are laughing at me." Now remember, this guy he's perfectly good, right? He's always smiling. He gets really upset over the fact that, that there are rumors. And he says to her again, "Look, were you faithful to me?" And she says, "Yeah, I walked through a gosh darn fire to prove my goodness and chasteness." And he says, "It's still not enough." And he exiles her. He sends her out for 12 years. He sends Lakshmana out, and he has Lakshmana take her out into the woods and leave her there for like 12 years. So she goes into this exile willingly. And remember that Rama needs to have a wife in order to do all these rituals. He needs to be doing Agni Chayanas, and he's said to do tons of Agni Chayanas, and finally he's going to set up a big Ashvamedha that's going to be a big deal in just a second here. So anyway, he banishes her to the forest, and he probably doesn't know at the time that she's pregnant. She's pregnant with twins. So she finds her way to an ashrama, a hermitage, who is in that hermitage? Valmiki, the author of the text. So she hangs out for like 12 or 14 years with Valmiki, raises her two kids. Valmiki trains them in Sanskrit recitation, all the Vedic rituals, and he's the first ones that he orally dictates the text to. They are the first ones to ever hear the Ramayana. Meanwhile, he also trains them in all of the ways of warfare and warfare and weapons training and archery. So Rama eventually decides to have an Ashvamedha because, he needs to. In fact, he wants to do like a royal coronation, what's called a Rajasuya, where there's the chariot race and he shoots the arrows and whatnot. But Lakshmana says, you know what? You should do the Ashvamedha because it's so powerful, it will wipe out all of your sins. But what are his sins? Well, he did kill Ravana, who was a demon but a Brahmin. That's a problem. He did cast off his wife. That's kind of a sin there. It's probably also, he killed Vali. That's no good. And he did it in a sleazy way. But then there's also the fact that there's still all these rumors. Now, remember, the Ashvamedha is thought to remove all sins gained in the process of getting power, to grant fertility everywhere, and to consolidate power. There's a problem here, though. He doesn't have a wife. How can he do an Ashvamedha without a wife? Well, they send the horse out for a year. He's chased, but he doesn't have a wife, so that's not that big of a deal. But he needs a wife to do this ritual. So evidently he proceeds, and there are some stories that while the horse is out wandering with the army, that the horse comes across Kusha and Lava, and they just beat down his army with ease. So anyway, the Ashvamedha is going on, and who comes wandering on in? Valmiki, Sita, Kusha, and Lava, his twin sons. So Rama's in doing his Ashvamedha, and in come these young warriors that everybody's like, oh, those got to be Rama's kids. But Rama doesn't see it because he's forgetful, because he somehow gets confused. He forgets that he's God, and he doesn't realize things because he gets all crazy in his head. So eventually these two young children start chanting, and they chant the Ramayana perfectly. And that's when he realizes, these are my sons. And he's pretty excited about the whole thing, kinda. Except he says, even in the midst of this ritual, he says to Sita, how is it that I can have you as my wife when people talk and say that you might have cheated on me? And how can I be sure you didn't cheat on me? And she basically says, look, I'm done. I put up with this when we were in the woods. I walked through the flame for you. I went into exile for you. I've come back with your children. I'm out. I'm done. I am pure. And she finally says to him, if I am pure, then may the earth swallow me up. And it happens. The earth swallows her up. Remember, her name means furrow. She was born from a crack in the earth. She was born out of Prithvi, the female earth that is a divinity. She returns to that earth. She's out. She's done. She'd been challenged. She's finally and irrefutably was devoured up by the earth, where she goes on to live in a celestial heavenly state. And Rama is still like, hey, I got her back a bunch of times. I can get her back. He cannot get her back from the earth. The earth will not give her up, and she don't want to come. In some stories, he's reunited with her in heaven because they are so much in love. I don't like that. I like to think they're separated forever because of his own wrong-headed dumbness and being obsessed with what people say and his own sexual anxieties. You got the greatest woman in the world who is absolutely perfect. Now, is she though? I mean, she could have spared a lot of people's death. Maybe if she hadn't been so obsessed with that one deer that she sent Rama and Lakshmana after, there's some problems there. But anyway, his boneheadedness secures that he will lose the thing he loves the most. Or does he? Because I think he kind of loves his reputation and his rule more. But these are the things you debate, because that's the thing about these stories. They're not simple. They're difficult. There's ambiguities. There isn't a right answer. And there are a lot of people that get really pissy about this whole business with Sita here. Now, there's another group. There's also a lot of people that say that these last stories about Sita going into the earth and the Agni Pariksha, that those didn't happen. That in fact, the end of the Ramayana is they return and they live happily ever after. But in our earliest Sanskrit text, these events are in there. They are baked in there. So Rama continues to rule and to sacrifice. And because he doesn't have a wife, he has a golden image of her made to stand in the rituals. Trust me, that's not in the Vedic text. You don't have a wife, you can't do the rituals. But he's got a workaround. Anyway, it doesn't end. Rama begins to suspect that Lakshmana slept with Sita while he was away chasing the deer or while he was taking her into exile. And in fact, he exiles Lakshmana. Lakshmana goes out and he's just kind of done with his life. He's in exile and he steps into the waters and he relinquishes his life. Is this sacrifice? Is this suicide? In fact, I would argue that I said that Lakshmana before is an incarnation of Ananta or Shesha, the divine serpent associated with Vishnu. That divine serpent lives in the waters, is of the waters. So in fact, he's not committing suicide. He's returning to where he came from. Not unlike Sita returns to the earth where she came from. I think that's a better understanding. So we'll see that Krishna's brother, Balarama, who's also an incarnation of the snake Shesha, will also dissolve himself into a serpent that goes into the waters at the end of the Mahabharata. So for the rest of that, we have a quote from Doniger. As the glorious and noble Rama ruled, this is from the 7th and last book of the Ramayana, as the glorious and noble Rama ruled, striving for Dharma a long time past. The bears and monkeys and ogres remained under Rama's control, and he conciliated kings every day. He made sure everything stayed cool. The gods of storms reigned at the proper time, so there was abundant food. The skies were clear. Happy, healthy people filled the city and the country. No one died at the wrong time. No living creatures got sick. There was no violation of Dharma at all when Rama ruled his kingdom. So this is the end of that third age, the Treta Yuga. The fourth age, the Kali Yuga, will begin in the Mahabharata as things start to go south for the world. But it's thought that Rama lives and has a solid rule without his wife, but with his kids. And he's a good king, and everything is right in the world. I can't let go of a few sins, though. I can't let go of the killing of Vali. I just can't. That's always going to bother me. And I can't get over why Sita doesn't just climb on Hanuman's back and insists on Rama come and killing Ravana and insists on Hanuman burning down the city. I mean, she could have diverted that. She doesn't. And why is she so obsessed with that deer in the first place? Well, for one reason, you got to move the story along. And these stories are only as good as they are ambiguous. Now, the Ramayana is not as ambiguous as the Mahabharata. When we get to the Mahabharata, every character will have a dark and tragic flaw. It's like life. But I hope you enjoyed spending a little time in the Ramayana. Maybe you won't be as obsessed. I've come to tears over the death of Vali every time I read it. I get very upset about Sita's decision to not defer the destruction of a lot of people and a lot of loss of life. And I get furious over Rama's ambiguity and ambivalence over his wife and his obsession with chastity and fidelity. But there are other tales, and in fact, there is another Ramayana out there, a sort of Sitayana, a story of the Ramayana from Sita's perspective, in which she kind of lays out a whole different sort of tale. All right, but that's a later one, and that's because people have to continue to think through these stories and try to figure them out and deal with their ambiguities. All right, I'll see you next time.